Budgeting can feel very intimidating, but there are many benefits to creating and maintaining a budget that makes sense for you. Let's explore how you can approach the process of creating and then living with your own budget. The first thing you need to do is define your priorities. This may not seem like the first step. After all, if you've never budgeted before, you may not even know where your money is going right now. And yes, that is very important. We'll cover that soon. But the most important thing is to know what matters to you. Because once we start working on the nuts and bolts of budgeting, it will be important that every decision you make will allow you to work toward goals and end results that are both meaningful and motivating in your life. Let's start with a question. What are your big rocks? When you consider your priorities in budgeting or in any aspect of your life, it helps to think of the big rock analogy. Imagine a big glass jar, and beside it you have enormous piles of three kinds of rocks. There are big rocks, small stones, and a mound of little pebbles. The big rocks are the things that matter most to you. In life, that might be family, faith, and your career, while in budgeting, they may be things like housing, transportation, and education. The small stones are the things you need, but the need isn't urgent or all-encompassing. The pebbles, meanwhile, are the things that you'd like to have and that bring joy to your life or fun to your budget, but they're not strictly necessary. If you pour all of the pebbles into your jar first, it will be full, but there won't be any room for the big rocks or the small stones, the things that matter and that you need. Likewise, if you fill your budget up with fun first, you won't leave room for what matters to you financially in the long run. But if you put the big rocks in first, then some small stones, and finally fill it all in with the pebbles, you can make sure that both your budget and your life are full of what matters and leaves room for some things that are fun as well. So, knowing that the big rocks matter, what's a good proportion to budget? This will vary according to your own needs, of course, including your income, the housing prices in your area, whether or not you need a car, for example. But many people recommend a 50-30-20 budgeting approach, which allocates 50% of your income to needs, 30% to wants, and 20% to savings and debt repayment. As you learn more about budgeting in this lesson, consider using that proportion as a starting point and then adjust according to your own situation and priorities. Budgets can be highly detailed or can include several large catch-all categories, but most experts agree that you should include some specifics in your budget. The graphic here shows some suggested allocations by major category. Note that this is for a slightly stricter budget than the 50-30-20 approach, with this budget only allowing 5 to 10% set aside for wants, which are also known as discretionary spending. But this gives you an idea of what the major categories are that you might want to consider. You may have other categories you would add or things you would change to reflect your own priorities. For example, if you have pets, you'll need to be sure that their care and needs are considered in your budget. If travel is important to you or is necessary to allow you to visit distant family, you'll need to decide if that should have its own category, or if one of your other budget categories, say transportation or discretionary spending, will encompass that necessary expense. Likewise, you may not need to spend as much on transportation, or your housing expenses may be low now, but your debt repayment could be higher for student loans at this point in your life. Now it's time to start collecting the receipts. So with a general idea of how you want to allocate your money, you need to get down to the business of making the budget. And the first step in that process is to find out where your money is already going. You may know right now what your major expenses are, so you could certainly slot them into a budget today. If you know, for example, that rent is $600, your car payment is $300, and your car insurance is $125 a month, those are relatively fixed things that you could easily account for without too much additional research or work. But what about everything else? You may need to examine or track your expenses for a while to know what you're spending now in order to create a budget that properly factors in your usual expenditures and lets you know where you might want to cut corners. You could do this by logging your expenses for the next month via a journal, a notes app on your phone, pictures of receipts, a budgeting tool, or if you tend to use your bank account for most things, you could check your bank account transaction record and log the amounts from there. It's up to you to decide how detailed you want to be. Some people prefer to know where every penny went. $10 for a movie ticket, $5 for popcorn, and $13 for shampoo and conditioner. Others may simply lump all of those into other items. $28 in discretionary spending, for example. Being more detail-oriented may take you more time, but it may also provide you with more insight. Only you can know what makes sense for you right now and what you're going to be able to keep up with. Once you know what you're spending, review your priorities again. We're going to keep coming back to this because it should be driving your decision-making in the budgeting process. If your priority is being able to buy your own house or pay off your student loans, but your spending doesn't reflect that, it's important to realize that you're not in alignment with the goals you've set for yourself. That can be a powerful motivator to make tough choices if you need to cut spending in another area. Finally, SWOT it. A SWOT analysis is a business process, and the acronym stands for Strengths, Weaknesses, Opportunities, and Threats. While you certainly don't need to do a full-scale SWOT analysis on your finances like one might do on a department at a major corporation, it's a helpful way to think of things. Strengths and weaknesses are things that exist now and are internal, so to speak, things you control or choose. Looking at your spending, you may decide a strength is that you already have $1,000 in savings, while a weakness is that your car is old and having lots of mechanical problems. Opportunities and threats, on the other hand, are things that could happen and are external. So an opportunity may be your upcoming graduation and the possibility that you'll be making significantly more money next year, while a threat may be that that graduation means you have to move to another town with higher expenses when you do get that job. Now that you know what your priorities are, what you're spending now, and what your opportunities, threats, strengths, and weaknesses could be, it's time to actually create the budget that brings all these pieces together. First, you'll need to decide what kind of budgeting tool you want to use. There are many ways you can create and maintain a budget, and we'll discuss some options in the next section of this lesson. Then you'll need to define your categories. What will you track? How will you group items together? And how detailed do you want to be? As with everything else in this process, it's up to you to decide what makes sense. If you have a very elaborate system but find it too burdensome to keep up with, then you won't actually use the budget. So whatever makes sense for you and the way that you like to keep track of things is going to be something that'll be useful and helpful to you moving forward. Now that you know what you're tracking and how, you can input your income and expenses. Put in what you're willing and able to spend in each category and what you're already obligated to spend, and think about whether you're happy with where you're at or if you want to work toward a change. For example, you may be spending 35% of your income on housing right now, but you may want to get that number down to 30%. So you'll need to decide if you're going to earn more money or find less expensive housing. That typically doesn't happen overnight, but you can set a goal to find cheaper housing when your current lease expires, for example, and then work to make that happen by ensuring you'll have the ability to pay for a security deposit, a moving truck, or whatever else you may need to do. You also need to think about how one category impacts the others, both now and in the future. If housing is low for you now, for example, if you're living with your family members, do you have the ability to reallocate some money? And if so, do you want or need to put it toward, say, student loan repayment, or can you increase your savings for future housing needs when your situation changes and you move out on your own. Finally, it's vital that you set a regular follow-up schedule. Making a budget is great, but if you don't come back to it regularly, at least once a month, then how do you know if you're doing what you set out to do? And how do you know if you need to change or adjust items in your budget? If your needs or priorities shift, you'll want your budget to reflect that. Likewise, if income or expenses change, you'll need to revisit the impact that has on your budget and your ability to meet those goals. If you share responsibility for your household with anyone else, a spouse, partner, or other family member, it's also important that everyone is involved in the budgeting process, both in making the decisions and in reviewing whether or not you're sticking to the plan. Even if you're only sharing some expenses, for example, rent and food with housemates, you should work to have regular discussions about those expenses and ensure everyone is on the same page. In the beginning of this lesson, you learned that almost 70% of Americans don't even have $1,000 in the bank and would struggle to resolve any emergency that required that amount of money without using a credit card or borrowing from a friend or family member. And this included many whose annual income is over $100,000. How much you make is important, of course, but how much you spend and how much you're able to save, regardless of your income, is even more meaningful. No matter what categories you have in your budget, the one you should never ever neglect is your savings. Later in this course, in Lesson 7, we'll spend more time on long-term savings and investment considerations. But building an emergency fund into your budget to handle short-term crises is a big step in the right direction. And don't be intimidated by the idea of creating that rainy day fund. Even a little bit of savings goes a long way. Just $250 to $750 squirreled away in a savings account can help you avoid eviction, missing a rent payment, or having to use a high-cost alternative service such as a payday loan if you encounter an emergency. The Urban Institute has analyzed that that little amount of money can make a significant difference in most American households. So start small and you'll see a big change in your financial security. That cushion will help you weather setbacks while you work on building a true emergency fund of 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. So now that you know the basics, in the next activity, you'll get to spend some time working with a budget template to actually practice what you've learned.